This week we will look at Beecham and Childress's third principle, the principle of beneficence. Similar to previous weeks, we will start by defining what beneficence is, and then we will look at a couple of distinctions: general beneficence versus specific beneficence, and obligatory beneficence versus ideal beneficence, and then finish with a conversation about reciprocity. Here at the start, I'm combining two different sections. So the first one is the concept of beneficence and principles of beneficence, and then one that's a little bit further down titled Distinguishing Rules of Beneficence from Rules of Non-Maleficence. So to begin, what is the principle of beneficence? It is a statement of moral obligation to act for the benefit of others. And if you remember when we were first talking about the Vaughan reading, and Vaughan outlined 5 different principles for bioethics, and I told you how there are typically 4, and that utility is usually integrated into the other principles. That's what Beecham and Childress are telling us here, because utilitarianism is about acting for the benefit of the most. If you remember, the greatest happiness principle is to maximize goodness for the most involved. And this idea of utility is all about use value. And so Beecham and Childress here are differentiating what is going on within beneficence, that there is this utility at play within these considerations, but that it's not necessarily the entirety of what we mean by the principle of beneficence. Instead, it's just one of these other considerations. It's a prima facie principle. Are you surprised how many times that term has come up? And that is why I began the semester by talking about it. So prima facie principles, hopefully by now you remember, are ones that we are obligated to uphold unless we are given a good moral reason to find an exception to that obligation. So I think beneficence is this idea of acting for the benefit of others. In that later section where we get the differentiation between rules of non-maleficence and rules of beneficence, Beecham and Childress talk about how rules of non-maleficence include these different features because they're negative prohibitions of actions. They must be followed impartially, and they also provide more reasons for legal prohibitions of certain forms of conduct. Whereas rules of beneficence present positive requirements of action. They also need not always be followed impartially, meaning, hopefully you remember from previous presentations, so partially meaning bias in a certain way. And so if we're acting for the benefit of a patient, typically if the patient is under our care, we might want to act partially towards them. Hopefully you also recall that that is a key feature of care ethics. And then usually do not need to provide reasons for legal punishment when agents fail to abide by them. So these are the differentiations between beneficence and non-maleficence. What's the key difference here? Hopefully you remember the difference between positive obligations and negative obligations. Which type of obligation is the principle of beneficence? Hopefully you can pick up that it's a positive obligation. It's one in which we have a requirement to act in a certain way, whereas the principle of non-maleficence is a negative obligation where we are obligated to not inflict harm. So that's a key distinction. Might want to think about it when it comes to the exam. So the first distinction that Beecham and Childress discuss is pretty straightforward. It's this one between general beneficence and specific beneficence, and it rests on this question: is beneficence owed to everyone equally? Are you obligated to treat everybody or promote the good of everybody equally? And that seems idealistic, which is ultimately Beecham and Childress's point, which is why we make this distinction between specific beneficence, which is sort of the idea that we owe beneficence to people within our sort of social sphere that we interact with. So immediately you should be thinking care ethics, that partiality that we were just talking about a moment ago. Specific beneficence is directed at particular parties such as children, friends, contractors, patients, family members, things like that, or sorry, groups like that, not necessarily things like that. And then general beneficence is more impartial. It's directed beyond these special relationships. It's extended to all persons. And so what is the obligation usually associated with the principle of beneficence? It's usually this idea that we owe specific beneficence to different individuals that are under our care. That doesn't mean that we don't or can't aspire to general beneficence, but Beecham and Childress are going to sort of reject that as an obligation that we don't necessarily. Well, they're going to reject it as an obligation that we have to uphold, and instead try to argue for a more moderate position. In this section here, where they introduced the distinction between general and specific beneficence, you see these couple paragraphs explaining Singer's position, where Singer is a utilitarian ethicist, really famous within animal rights conversations, but also just a really popular utilitarian ethicist in general. And Singer argues for this distinction between preventing evil and promoting good. And we get this line here in the reading where, let me find it here. Singer's criterion of comparable importance sets a limit on sacrifice. Ultimately, Singer is going to argue we ought to donate time and resources until we reach a level at which, by giving more, we would sacrifice something of comparable moral importance. The idea is that if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. And what Beecham and Childress ultimately sort of arrive at in relation to Singer's position is they say that Singer is identifying this commendable moral ideal, but it's not necessarily an obligation. It seems too demanding to expect that we're going to be able to make these sacrifices or put it on ourselves, these burdens in all these different situations. I really like this one quote that's right before the Singer discussion, where they say, it's a little bit lengthy, so I apologize in advance. They say, the notion that we have the same impartial obligations of beneficence to persons we do not know as we have to our own families is overly romantic and impractical. It is also perilous because this standard may divert attention from our obligations to those with whom we have special moral relationships and to whom our responsibilities are clear rather than clouded. The more widely we generalize obligations of beneficence, the less likely we will be to meet our primary responsibilities. And I really like this line. Obviously, you don't have to agree with Beecham and Childress on their argument that we don't necessarily have to aspire to the degree of general beneficence that Singer is suggesting that we do. Why I really like this, especially within the scope of principle of beneficence, what we're talking about in bioethics, I think care ethics has a really important role to play here. Ultimately, your responsibilities are going to be with the patients that you interact with, and so it makes more sense to make sure that we are meeting our obligations to these, or to the extent that we have specific beneficence obligations to the people within our close proximity, within our proximity that we interact with on a daily basis. The previous discussion about specific beneficence versus general beneficence dovetails nicely into the second distinction of obligatory beneficence versus ideal beneficence. So the sort of stock example for this is, say that you're out walking and you see a person drowning. You're the only person around. Are you obligated to jump in to try to save them? Well, your response might depend on a number of different factors here. So first one being, are you able to swim? If you're not able to swim, it probably doesn't seem obligatory for you to also sacrifice your life and not successfully save the life of the person who's drowning. The other thing you might consider is, what if hopping into the water might make you sick? like give you a cold or something like that, or it might destroy your clothes that are really expensive, is taking on that type of injury or that type of harm for yourself reason enough to not have to go in and save this person? I imagine that your intuition is to say, no, I think somebody's life is more important than whether or not I have to deal with a cold for a couple days or if I have to purchase new clothes. So this is getting at what Beecham and Childress outline as the criteria that differentiates obligatory beneficence versus ideal beneficence. And they say that we have this obligation, this prima facie obligation of beneficence toward a person. Let's call them Y. I know this might look a little bit confusing. We haven't really done any of this formal philosophy stuff yet, but Y stands for a person. X is going to stand for the person who is, let's say, the onlooker going to save this person who's drowning. Y is the person who's drowning. So the first one, or the sort of first criterion here, is that Y is at risk of significant loss of or damage to life, health, or some other basic interest. So person drowning, their life is at risk. X's action, the onlooker, is necessary to prevent this loss or damage. So if you're the only person around, there's nobody else who can do it. So your action as the onlooker would be necessary. Then the onlooker's action will probably prevent this loss or damage. So if you don't know how to swim, it's probably not going to prevent this loss. So only if you have the ability to sort of bring about the certain outcome that is alleviating the harm that Y is experiencing. That's another criterion. And then the onlooker's action, X's action, would not present significant risks, costs, or burdens to X. So if you don't know how to swim, and it could ultimately be the case that you drown trying to save this other person who's drowning, that would pose significant risks or costs to you as the onlooker. And then the benefit that Y, the person who's drowning, can be expected to gain outweighs any harms, costs, or burdens that X is likely to incur. So if you're going to get a cold or you're going to destroy your clothes that you're wearing, that doesn't seem like a loss that is equal or greater than the benefit of the person who's drowning is to save. So only if all of these criteria hold is it in a case of obligatory beneficence. Otherwise, it's ideal beneficence. It means that you're going above and beyond what is expected. And one of the cases that Beecham and Childress outline here, it actually showed up earlier in the reading about the cousin who sort of backs out of doing this bone marrow transplant. So it's here on page 207 to 208 in my 7th edition. Starts with, in the first case, which was originally introduced in chapter 5, Robert McFall was diagnosed as having aplastic anemia, which is often fatal, but his physician believed that a bone marrow transplant from a genetically compatible donor could increase his chances of surviving. So ultimately, the cousin goes through the testing. It's shown that the cousin is going to be a match, but then ultimately the cousin pulls out from donating their bone marrow. And ultimately, the person who has the disease, the aplastic anemia, tries to sue and try to compel their cousin to donate their bone marrow. And so the question is, since this cousin is the only person who has the ability to provide this sort of good for the person who has the disease, are they compelled to have to do it? And here, what's interesting, or at least how Beecham and Childress sort of diagnose or deconstruct the argument with relation to these criteria, they talk about how condition 3 is not satisfied in this situation, mainly because the bone marrow transplant was only supposed to increase the chances of the infirmed cousin's sort of life expectancy from like 25% to between 40 and 60%. And then The other issue that Beecham and Childress talk about, which obviously seems to be the case for the cousin who decides not to provide their bone marrow, is that they were worried about condition 4, that providing their bone marrow was actually going to cause them significant risks, costs, or burdens. They were talking about how it might end up being painful because it would be 100 to 150 punctures of the pelvic bone, and there was a 1 in 10,000 chance of death from anesthesia. All of this, Beecham and Childress say, don't really actually amount to enough to appeal to this 4th criterion as a reason not to provide the bone marrow as a donation for their cousin here. Why? Because it seems like the concerns of the cousin, the donating one, are not reasonable given all of the different checks in place. And so why I really like this case is it shows how it's a really complicated sort of situation insofar as, people are going to have different impressions about what is a harm, what type of risks, how are they getting weighted. And so this sort of framework that Beecham and Childress are providing with us is in no way a roadmap that you can just appeal to without having to put any critical thought into it yourself. So it's really important that you could argue each one of these different criteria and explain why each is satisfied or unsatisfied. And in that case, you can distinguish between these cases of obligatory beneficence versus ideal beneficence. I want to finish with a brief discussion of reciprocity and how this sort of pops up in this chapter in connection to research. So the question is typically asked, especially in situations where people have a terminal disease and there's an experimental treatment out there. There's a research study being done or clinical trials. And the question is, should patients have access to experimental treatments? And there are two different ways of interpreting this. So expanded access is when patients are, especially when they're seriously ill, and there is no other treatment offered to them. There's nothing that they can do, and they can't actually enroll into the clinical trial. Maybe they are provided with this experimental treatment because they have no other option. So that would be a case of expanded access. Continued access happens when subjects are participating in these clinical trials, and this investigational product ultimately shows some benefit for them. And once the clinical trial ends, then the patients who participated are allowed to continue if it's showing signs or positive outcomes, this effective treatments. And so expanded access is a way in which we describe situations where patients who are not within the trial who get access to these treatments, and then continued access are participants within a trial who get to continue using the treatment or having access to the treatment. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later, as I'll mention here in a second. But the whole idea, especially with the continued access, is this notion of reciprocity. So if you've heard the term reciprocity before, it just means that an act or practice of making an appropriate and often proportional return. So patients who take on the burdens or risks associated with a clinical trial, there seems to be a responsibility of reciprocity to allow them to continue to have access to this treatment because they took the risks and they paid off. And so now it seems like we have a responsibility to help them out, to return the favor. And in this way, I think we see a lot of really interesting sort of discussions play out in the bioethics sphere and what our responsibilities are and how we start setting priorities. Because in this section here a reciprocity-based justification of obligations of beneficence, Beecham and Childress give us the example of organ donors, right? So we were talking about this before with the opt-in versus opt-out model. Should organ donation be an opt-out model where people are assumed to be organ donors, but they have to explicitly say that they are not organ donors, because a lot of people end up dying waiting for organs, and so that would be one remedy to it. Another remedy might be that if you decide to be an organ donor, that you get sort of prioritized if you ever have to register or get on the registered list for people who are awaiting an organ. Why? Because you were the one who took the sort of, you were the one who was willing to offer an organ if something were to happen to you, and so it seems like it would only be right that reciprocity would dictate that the prioritization would go back to you because you were willing to provide it. So you should also be given some sort of standing insofar as that you would be the one to receive it first. So this is just the idea of reciprocity. I'm not trying to say that everybody has to be an organ donor to have access to organs, nothing like that. But it's just based on this principle of reciprocity that ultimately there seems to be some responsibility that if somebody takes on risks for the sake of others, that if the shoe was on the other foot, so they would say, that there is some benefit in that way. Now, we'll return to this idea about access to experimental treatments later in the semester when we're talking about access to healthcare. So, like I said, I was trying to keep this slide pretty brief, but I do want to also note before moving on to our summary slide that if you remember from a previous lecture where we were talking about therapeutic misconception, so therapeutic misconception occurs when patients join a clinical trial thinking that it's going to automatically benefit them, or they're thinking that they have the misconception that the clinical trial is about helping them specifically, where in reality a clinical trial is about collecting data about the treatment, about its safety, rather than actually helping the patients right now, right? So the whole idea of a clinical trial is benefiting future patients, and sometimes when patients register for these clinical trials, they have this misconception that it's actually something that's going to help them directly, or it's meant to do that. And so that's where this continued access sort of comes into play, where if it happens to show that it's effective, then that seems to be grounds for continuing to allow the patient to access it. But it gets a lot more complicated, which we'll talk about with the right to try laws later in the semester. So let's finish up here with a summary. So beneficence is a positive obligation to act in a way that benefits others. We have different types of beneficence. Insofar as specific beneficence is designated for close relationships, these would be partial. These would be within our sort of social sphere, the ones that we interact with, whereas general beneficence is directed to all persons, and this is where impartiality is actually into play. There's also this idea that we don't necessarily have an obligation for these acts of rescue. Instead, if they were going to cause undue burdens, or they weren't going to meet those 5 criteria that we talked about, those are considered ideal situations of beneficence rather than obligatory ones. And then we were just talking about the principle of reciprocity insofar as like returning good in proportion to the amount that the person has actually performed a good for another person. Before finishing this, I just want to pose this question to you. I hinted at it in one of the earlier slides, but what is the difference between the principle of beneficence and the principle of non-maleficence? You might want to be able to answer that before the exam. Just nod, nod, wink, wink. So just be thinking about it here.